And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 216. Today we're going to be talking about the notion of faceless portraits. So we all know what a portrait is. Generally speaking, it's a face. So can we actually create portraits without a face? This is going to be the thing we're going to be investigating today. So if you happen to be watching live, leave a comment, say hello, and we'll make a start. Yes, so today, welcome. Yes, we're talking about the notion of faceless portraits. So I'll come on to that in a sec. And like I say, if you happen to be watching live, leave a comment. Let me know you're here. Let me know where you're from. Let me know what the weather's doing. Let's get the chat started. And if you happen to be watching the recording, then you can still leave comments. Obviously, you can't leave them live as they go, but if things occur to you, then do feel like, you can leave a comment down below. Generally speaking, YouTube tends to inform me of them, so at some point in the future, I may well get back to leaving a comment on them as well, or replying to you. Right, so let's well, I can see we've got a couple of comments in already, so let's take a quick look here. April says, greetings from a partly cloudy Long Island, New York. Nadia says, hi from a cold and sunny Fife. Susan says, hello from a sunny Kakubri. Yes, after 2 weeks of murky, grey, damp and miserable weather, the sun finally appeared about an hour ago. And this is true. Kakubri is just 9 miles down the road from Castle Douglas, where I'm broadcasting this from. And I was incredibly surprised to suddenly see a patch of blue sky appear. It has really been dreich, dull and miserable for quite a while now. I don't know how my sound is coming across. This past week I have had a really horrible cold flu type thing, and ears slightly blocked, still a little bit of discomfort when I swallow, which I'm having to do quite frequently to keep my throat from drying out. However, excuse me, bits of cough as well. I should have enough energy to get through. Robert Schaefer says, good morning from a sunny Dallas. Marilyn says, hello from Colorado, where we are buried 3 feet under 3 feet of snow. That's amazing, Marilyn. I don't think we even got snow last winter. If we did, it certainly didn't really settle. I haven't for the last couple of winters either. So 3 feet of snow, can't imagine. April and Susan are joining in conversations going on with Marilyn now. John Harvey says hello from a wet mid-Ohio, and Sandra joins us from a cloudy Birmingham, says hello everyone, and Robert Gullick also from Texas says howdy all from Texas. So welcome all. We have people, we have pictures, we have a topic. What we also have are smug points. So, I'll do a little detour, first of all, into the notion of smug points. Partly because the smug points for October were won by VG. So smug points, for anybody who doesn't know, who might be watching the recordings, not one of the regular slot, smug points are created by your contributions to the podcast. So just by turning up here live, saying hello, leaving a comment, letting me know you're here, you automatically get 5 smug points. If you happen to contribute an image to one of the challenges, you get 10 smug points. If you contribute an image for critique or feedback, you get 25 smug points. So there's various different ways you can, and there's a kind of an accumulated smug points leaderboard as such. And if you accumulate the most smug points for the month, you get to choose the challenge for the following month. Now, why that's significant now is because VG in Chennai in India won the smug points leaderboard for October. And so when I asked her what she might want to suggest for November challenge, she came up with the idea of faceless portraits. And I thought this was quite a fascinating one. It's not one we've covered in any of the 215 previous episodes of this podcast. Although I have done once or twice done portrait challenges, and some people have veered into that sort of faceless or semi-faceless portrait challenge. So I thought this would be quite a good topic to explore. But in terms of smug points so far accumulated for November, because of the challenge that we had last week, which VG then won as well, she's currently in the lead with 45 smug points for November. Susan is in second place with 35 smug points. Graham in third with 30, and Meg, April, Stacey and Rebecca all have 20 smug points each. So November's still wide open there. For next week, there's going to be opportunities, well, the next couple of weeks, there's going to be opportunities to score high in the Smug Points. So plenty to play for. And in terms of, we're into the final quarter now. Now, instead of just adding up the final quarter, what I'm doing is we're getting to essentially the final of the whole year. People have been accumulating Smug Points since the beginning of January when I introduced this Smug Points idea. And out there in the lead, again, is VG, who's currently on just a slice over 600 Smug Points. But Robert Gullick from Texas is on 520. April's on 515. So whilst nearly 100 Smug Points sounds a lot, actually we still have the whole of November and most of December, or pretty much all of December, in order to be able to catch up. So still very much within distance, and still also kind of within shot if the wind blows in the right direction and they put in the effort. Sandra, Susan, Janet, Nadia, Meg are still, I would say, within shot of being the winners for the entire year. And for the annual, for those who have accumulated the most Smug Points over the course of the year, I will do a personal mentoring session with you. Now, if you happen to live locally or want to come to the area, then we can work out something for that from face-to-face. If you live too far, even a different country or different part of the country where it's too difficult, then we can certainly arrange something via video calls and stuff like that. So something hopefully worth a personalised mentoring session specifically for you. What else do we have? Oh, we have a couple more people who've said, who've come in. Little bits of chat going on. Oh, Nick's joined us from Mars, says hello all from cloudy West Country. Meg's joined us also, says hello everyone. And Andy's joined us, says hello everyone, and so has VG, says good evening everyone. Excellent. Right, so let's make a little start then on this notion of faceless portraits. So first of all, I mean, I suppose we go, well, what is a portrait? And a portrait, as we think of it, tends to be a photograph of somebody's face, or at least where the face is clearly visible, and not just but we're not just thinking about the face. I mean, in a way, a passport photo could be called a portrait, but we don't tend to think of it as a portrait. It's there as a likeness. It tells us the features of a person's face, so proportionally to the nose, how far are the eyes apart, how thick are the eyebrows, roughly what kind of age, the amount of wrinkles, hair colour, all that kind of thing. And that's fine for identification purposes. When we travel to another country and we have to show our passport, the person looks at the details on that, checks the photo against our face and goes, okay, this looks like you are the person you're saying that you are. So in terms of identification, that's what the passport photo is for. Similarly for driving licenses and some other forms of photo ID. But is it a portrait? What do we think of when we mean portrait? A portrait we tend to think of as something telling us something more about the person. So it's not just a case of necessarily what they look like, but what else can we deduce beyond looks about the person, about the personality, about the mood, the feel, the occupation, or anything else? Can we glean some kind of extra information about who it is beyond just the likeness? That's what a portrait is. That's what we tend to think of as a portrait. Now, within that, we can then add other things. So very often, of course, the thing that's immediately telling us the most is the face, because it tends to be the expression on the face. And if you do portrait photography for a living, like as I tend to do, very often we're saying, well, okay, people are going to be looking at this photo. What impression do you want to have when people look at this photo? Do you want them to think you are strong and authoritative, in which case you need one kind of expression? Do you need to look warm and friendly, in which perhaps you need a different kind of expression? Do you need to look wild and wacky, or thoughtful and intellectual? And then on top of what face expression you've got, there's maybe the clothes that you happen to be wearing, or the background that you happen to have behind you, or if you are pulled out a little bit, are you involved in some kind of action? So each of these things then is adding to this idea that, I mean, if I've got a portrait of you and you happen to be dressed in a basketball kit and holding a basketball, that's saying something completely different than if you happen to be dressed in waders and fishing gear and holding a fishing rod. And it's different if you're snarling at the camera than if you're smiling at the camera. But if we remove the face, if we remove the expression, actually all these secondary things like the background, what you're wearing, and stuff like that, and any props you might be holding, these now take on a much greater significance. These then become really important, because without being able to necessarily see the face, how can we still garner something of the person or the personality or the mood and the feel of the person in front of us from the image? And that's really what the nub of a faceless portrait is about. Now, part of the reason I'm talking about all faceless portraits as well, VG suggestion, is because it is a challenge. Because in 2 weeks' time, I'm going to be we will have the Faceless Portrait Challenge. So I'm really hoping that you will all give this a bit of a go. So I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the podcast, so don't run away too quickly. But basically, I'm going to now run through a whole bunch of different ideas, give you a sense of ways you can approach this topic. Now, it's not just for my challenge. Like all these things, pretty much every challenge we ever have also tends to appear on a lot of sites like PhotoCrowd or ViewBug or Guru Shots, any of these online sites which holds competitions. And of course, many of you belong to camera clubs, and sometimes this is a topic that might appear in a camera club as well. So getting an understanding of this topic helps to expand the number of places you can place your photos for competitions, but it also expands your idea of what you can do with your camera. So I'm going to go through ideas. As I put up pictures, feel free to comment on the pictures. If you get questions as I go, ask the questions. There's a whole chat box here. Type into them. You know, let me know what your questions are. Either I will be answering them later on in the podcast, or I'll go off on a little tangent. But somehow the idea here is for you to gain a better understanding of what's going on. So with that, April said, I like this topic because taking people pictures, I like taking people pictures, usually behind them. Well, if you're one of these people who likes to stand behind people and take photos of the back of their heads, you're straight into the right place. Right, okay. So what are we going to talk about then? Where do we go? Okay, so if we are talking about this idea then of taking a photo of somebody where we can't see the face, something then is obscuring, either something is obscuring the face or we're not at the right angle. So what I'll do then is let's start off with the idea, well, actually, I'll tell you what, what are the boundaries? What actually counts as a faceless portrait? I think that's probably the best place to start. Because what counts as a faceless portrait is going to vary. It's not absolutely carved in stone with definite lines. For some, a faceless portrait can actually still include quite a bit of the face, but part of it is obscured. How much of it is obscured might have shifting boundaries, right through to have you got somebody included at all. So let me give you two sort of extreme versions. So let's first of all, let me flip over here. If I do this, hopefully now on screen you should see. So this was a portrait I did, a wee self-portrait back during lockdown and COVID, a couple of years back. I was just aware of, having the mask. I would go out for a walk, I would have my woolly hat on, especially in the winter, a bit cold, have the mask on, and essentially only my eyes were being seen. So is this a faceless portrait? And in some ways, yes. Most of my face is obscured. But you can see my eyes. And for the purpose of this photo, I decided to stare quite intensely into the camera. That notion then, these are not smiley eyes. There's potentially different ways you can read the expression in this. And when we come down to this notion of portrait, generally speaking, the eyes tend to be the most important part of a face. That, okay, yeah, what's happening with the nose and maybe whether somebody's smiling, but you can even have, if somebody's smiling with their mouth but their eyes aren't smiling, that tells us something different. If their eyes are covered, then the smile will tend to take the smile slightly more at face value. But actually, the eyes will tell us the truth of the smile. Of every part of the feature of the face, the eyes tend to be the most important part of a portrait. And certainly when you're talking about focusing, you have to be able to make sure that at least one of the eyes is focused, and the eye that is in focus is the one that tends to be closest to the camera, unless there's a very, very good reason not to. Okay, so we understand that within portraiture, the eyes are the most important part of the face. So in a way, the eyes are not just a bit of the face. The eye, I mean, when you look at my whole face, my eyes are only taking up, what, 5%? Okay, include the eyebrows, 10%, 15% of my face. But they are actually, in terms of importance, they're possibly 75, 80%, if not more, of the importance of the face. So when we talk about faceless portrait, the fact that you can see the eyes, and the fact that in something like this, the eyes are actually the key feature, what I was doing with the rest of my face in this picture would be almost irrelevant, means that we're right on the edge, the border of what you might call a faceless portrait. What that means is if you were entering a competition where it said faceless portrait and you are on one of these sites like Photocrowd or Viewbug, where you have a very high ratio of people who are taking photos, making votes on your photos, crowd voting where people are spending a quarter of a second or less on your image. They're making an instant judgment. They're going faceless, faceless, yes, no, like, not like, whatever. Then actually they can see the eyes. They instantly kind of, you're more likely to get marked down. So that's a sort of one end then. So at one end is if you're really including the eyes, and the eyes are really, you're kind of on the border. Some people will accept it, some people won't. But what about the other extreme? The other extreme, how far can you go in terms of not being able to see the face? And the next one I wanted to show you was this. Now this is one of a series of photos I did for a woman called Susan, who I know is a wheelchair user. And we set about, after brainstorming and exploring ideas, I did a whole series of photos for Susan, where she is actually absent from the photos. But part of her thing was the fact that her wheelchair very often gets used for a whole pile of things other than wheelchair. She's not only sitting in the wheelchair to be able to move from one place to another. It can also get used to put the dirty washing basket or to hang things out on the line. It can be used for the shop as a kind of shopping trolley. And sometimes she's sort of sitting there and it's being used for when she's doing her knitting, whether she's sitting in it doing her knitting or whether she's sitting on a chair and using it to rest her knitting while she's kind of... And so this was a whole kind of story exploration that I was doing with Susan. And in this case, what we were trying to do was essentially we were creating a portrait of Susan without Susan in it. Okay, so in terms of faceless portrait, this is at the other extreme. This picture, we have a wheelchair, we have a ball of wool, we have knitting needles, we have a tape measure. The wheelchair is actually placed next to the window, which then looks out onto the garden, and we can see a bit of tree and a house opposite. So there's actually quite a lot of information we can garner about the person this photo is about, even though that person isn't in the actual photo. So from the one extreme whereby you can see the eyes and they're making up most of the image, through to the other where you don't have a person in it at all, does this count as a faceless portrait? Now again, if you are in a crowd voting situation, I would say no. In a crowd voting situation, a lot of people would just go, oh, there isn't a person in there at all. No, okay? You wouldn't get your like, you wouldn't get your vote. Depending on where it's going, is potentially, if you had the right kind, if you were submitting this to a place that was being judged by a person, by an expert in their field, they might be slightly more interested in this. It's a borderline. You might just be able to squeeze it in. But, and this is kind of the point that I want to make, is that at the edges, the further you move out to the boundaries of what you would call a faceless portrait, you potentially have the chance to create more interesting photos, more philosophically interesting photos, a place to really explore concept and narrative. But you also move further away from what generally pleases the crowd. So, as I've said so often before in challenges, understand your judge. Who's judging this? And a crowd voting judging system is going to be very different to an expert judging system. But even within experts themselves, what's the brief? Where is it going to be placed? All these kind of things are going to make a huge difference as to what counts for any particular competition. So that's the starting point I wanted to start with, is this notion of where your boundaries are. And we have the boundaries from where you can really get an awful lot of information out of the face, it's only partially covered, through to there's no face, there's not even a person in it. The rest of this is going to be somewhere for much closer in between with that. Okay, any questions? Right, while you have it, I've nothing appearing immediately on the screen, but if you have questions, as I say, plonk them into the comments, and I can read them as we go. So where are we going to go now? Okay, well, I'll tell you what, let's flip into the basic idea, your first starting point. And a bit like April said, she likes photographing the back of people's heads. So for those of you who were waiting for this podcast to start, this is the image I used for my cover image, and I picked this one very deliberately because it's what we tend to think of as a faceless portrait. So I may well have talked about this photo in the past, I can't remember. I did a series of photos for a woman who lives out near Borg. Susan will know the region, not far from Kirkcudbright. And up on the top of the hill, she lived in a farm, just down from the farmhouse. There were a couple of these wonderful wind-sculpted hawthorn trees, and then with this wonderful view down the valley out towards the Solway coast. And she had this wonderful dress, this red dress, and we did a few photos of her, out by the tree in this red dress. And nearly all the photos, she's looking at the camera. There were once or twice she turned away, and there was a moment she turned away, she was looking down, and I thought, oh, there's something in that. So I did a quick set up a light off to one side, took this photo. And this is probably, of all the photos I took of her, actually the most moody, interesting photo I created from that set. The rest where she's facing the camera, and we had a fun time, a good laugh, and created some lovely photos. But actually, I would say this is the one that captures the most mood, and you can't actually see her face. Now, the fact that we can't see her face also is why I'm allowed to use this photo. It was a private shoot. She didn't really want me using the photos for publicising my business. However, she was always fine with this one because she herself is not identifiable in the photo, so she didn't mind me using it. But this notion here where we can't see the face, everything else comes into it. The tree, the dress, the fact that the dress is being blown in the wind, the dull sky with the bits of sunlight, the mood of the light, and the view down the valley, all gives us this sort of sense of a sort of melancholic longing. Is she waiting for a lost love? There's ways you can read the story, and so that notion then, there is no face, but there is a huge amount of potential story to be taken from this. Comment here, April says, I like this photo. Kim. Robert says, to reduce the confusion, okay, there's bits of comments between, we have two Roberts from Texas, so they're chatting that one out. Sandra says, oh, this is my idea of a faceless portrait. Yeah, so this is, like I say, kind of where we start. It's this notion of the back of someone. Let's other versions then. It doesn't necessarily have to be the back, side. In this case, what we've got is we've got a woman in action. This was now, for all the fact which I was saying that we haven't had any snow in the last couple of winters, this wasn't taken. This was taken a good 10 years ago, when we did actually have quite a big snowfall one winter. Just a bit of street photography. She was walking out to get into a taxi, and this notion of here we've got short skirt, bare legs, high heels, and snow. And so there's story there. There's a feeling of, and but she's also got a fancy bag. And so there's a feeling of something going on. We can't see her face, but we're getting a sense, there's a sense of personality on some level is being communicated. Not everybody would go, no matter whether you're going to a party or some big fancy do, would be heading out into the snow in a short skirt and high heels. So that's automatically telling us something. Now, it's not telling us everything. Of course, we never know the whole story, and photography isn't about knowing the whole story. Photography is about implication. Okay, so this implies something. Then we have the idea of, say, something like this one. Now we're back to the back of someone, also in movement. So this was a photo I did of a musician, and we're down at the beach, opposite time of the year, obviously, we're down in the summer, also short skirt, not wearing heels, she's got boots, but she's carrying the boots because she's walking across wet sand towards a rocky spot where we actually did some more photography, and she's carrying a guitar in her guitar case. So again, we can't see the face, but there's a guitar case, she's holding her boots, it's wet sand, there's a whole kind of story going on to it. Leaf blower. I think did I show this one last week, I think, or a couple of weeks ago, talking about that. I think it was for the autumn or fall challenge. Again, so this is very much about that notion of action. So we can't see the face, but we've got the props. We've got the leaves blowing about the place. We've got the misty day. There's a whole kind of mood. You can kind of almost smell the dampness of the situation. You can almost hear the petrol engine, the two-stroke engine going of the leaf blower in action. Or this one here, where we have an aerial dancer. And, so this was at an event I was at, and suddenly, two people came, for local people, this was out at the Easterbrook Hall, can't remember the actual event or what it was, but I was out there, and then suddenly these great long, two people came kind of twirling down these wonderful pieces of cloth, and so I managed to shoot off a few photos. Beautiful lines. I've used this one in various online competitions, usually scores fairly well. You're not seeing the face, but you're seeing the action. This is about line, form, light, action. And so, though, the way, the shapes and everything. And so, if you're not seeing the face, back to this notion that your use of line, colour, perhaps, form, also can become really important in conveying a mood, a feel, a story, a narrative. And I think sometimes this is kind of where it can become interesting in this notion of what a faceless portrait is, or rather why it's worth exploring the idea of doing faceless portraits, even if you're not really into portraits, is because it forces you to get more creative. I mean, great when you've got a real face in front of you and you can interact with them, or you can explore. They've got a craggy face, or they've got an interesting face, or they've got a face that's really good at throwing interesting expressions, and there's a great dynamic with the camera. That's all brilliant. When you remove the face, it forces you to really look and think in other ways. And this is what this is about. And this is what actually, if you like, what these podcasts are about. These podcasts aren't just about how to improve your photography by learning the difference between an f5.6 and an f11. It's about trying to open your mind to the idea of creativity, of looking at things in a slightly different way, of trying to become slightly more creative in the way that you and your camera, you use your camera to interact with the environment around you. What have we got here? Orvigi says one of the best photos of Kim's. That's one of the, if we're going back a couple. Vigi says good one. Wow, splendid. Meg says, could you use a blindfold for this challenge or not? Blindfold. It's difficult to take a photo if you've got a blindfold on. That's a different challenge, I think. But yes, taking a photo of somebody who's wearing a blindfold, I think that's an interesting idea, Meg. And I think it kind of depends at this point then of how much of the face it's obscuring. And we're coming back to this little bit of how much of a face counts as a face. So if it's just covering the eyes, but you can see most of the face and the rest of the face has got an expression, I think it's a tricky one. Again, I think it's that's moving out towards the edge of what still counts as a faceless portrait. So there's room for debate on it, really, within that one. But if you are using crowd voting competitions, if you're placing your picture into one of these crowd voting sites, the chances are a blindfold wouldn't be enough to get into the higher levels of the votes and achievements, I would say, because too many people would think I can see too much of the face. Depending on the blindfold, because there may be, if there's something else in the blindfold, which is, you know, something to do with the patterns, or if there's writing on it or something, then that in turn might imply more, then that could be interesting. That could be interesting to explore. But something to maybe play around with. Okay, so now sometimes you end up with faceless portrait. In fact, actually, we can see 4 faces. This becomes a sort of slightly interesting one, because the person herself, the woman. I took this at a concert of Status Quo when they played in Dumfries several years ago, and so the woman herself, we can't see her face. We've got the back of the head. So if you like, classic faceless portrait. Just about make out eyelashes, tiny bit of nose. Certainly not enough of a face for anybody to complain that it's not a proper faceless portrait. We can't see her face. We wouldn't be able to recognise her in the street from the front in that sense. Now, she has multiple piercings in the ear, so that tells us something. But the biggest thing that tells us is the tattoos that she's got on her back. And there at the top, we've got the 2 key people of Status Quo, as well as Freddie Mercury and suddenly forgotten his name, but lead singer of AC/DC. So this becomes a kind of interesting one. Is it a faceless portrait or not, when we've actually got 4 portraits actually on her back? So I think this is one where you kind of get into the philosophical fun of it, you know. On the one hand, it's definitely not a faceless portrait, and on the other hand, it definitely is. So, nice little bit of fun kind of idea. Robert says, Brian Johnson from AC/DC. Yes, that's the guy, Brian Johnson. Thank you for that. Other Robert says, this was a question I had. Is a profile or side shot that includes a partial face considered faceless? And I think, again, we're coming back down to how much of a face. In essence, the more of the face revealed, the less faceless it is. What we're talking about here is a notion of a continuum, right? You move from 0 face being able to seen to complete face being seen, and then somewhere along here, you're going to say, where does it move from a face to faceless? And for some people, the faceless will be absolutely, if I can see any part of the face, there's a bit of face, therefore it doesn't count. And for some people, well, we can allow a bit of the face. We can allow a bit of the ear and a bit of the cheekbone because we can't see an expression. Another one might say, if we couldn't recognise them in the street from that, so a bit like I said, where, you know, with this person, if we were facing them, if walking down the street, seeing them, would we be able to go, oh, that's the person from the photo? And if you can, then probably, you know, that's not really a faceless portrait. Obviously, then there's confusion if you already happen to know the person. But I think that's a slightly different argument. Then there's the notion of, if we flip back here, let's just, not that one, this one, yes. Where you end up with both yes and no. Is it a faceless portrait? Excuse me. It's a faceless portrait of Gina here, because we can't see her face, but it's clearly not a faceless portrait of her daughter Amelia. So if you were to crop off Amelia, then you have a faceless portrait. If you were to include, you definitely don't have a faceless portrait. So actually, can you get away with this as a faceless portrait? I would say no, because ultimately anybody who looks at this is going to see the wee girl's face and they're going to assume that that's what the portrait is about. That's where your eyes get drawn to first. So even though you could say, I've put in a faceless portrait of Amelia's mother, you have to then set about explaining it. And I think, again, certainly in any crowd voting situation, you just wouldn't stand a chance with something like that. Okay. So the next thing then is the notion of we move into silhouette or shadow. Okay. So now in this case, so this photo of my friend Alan, Alan Wright, another landscape photographer. We went out together. He was showing me some landscape photography tips. This was several years ago, down near Kakubri Bay. The sun was setting, and I got this lovely silhouetted shot of him. And we can see it's him holding the camera. It got me in the way here. If I just kind of zoom in a little bit, pull that over. I mean, I could just crop it like that for the sake of this. Now, we can't see the whole face. We can see a bit of the nose. We've got an outline. So to go back to Robert Schaefer's point of a side shot of a face, I think this can happily count as a faceless portrait, because although we've got an outline, we can't see his expression. If we were to bring up the shadows and be able to see his face, then we would be able to see a face. We would be able to see a face that we recognise. If we were walking down the street, we would be able to see a face, an expression on his face. His face would be there to inform us of what was going on. The fact is, though, with this, because he's a silhouette, we can't see his face, and therefore this counts as, quite happily, a faceless portrait. And likewise with this one, we can see a little bit in some ways. Now we've got light directly behind, which is catching the light and actually giving a clearer outline. Edge lighting, we've got edge lighting on the. And there's little bits more here. There's a tip of a piano down here. This woman was actually playing the piano at the time, had a light set up behind her. And so she was lost in silhouette, but I think again happily counts as faceless portrait. We can see part of the face, but we're not seeing enough of the face to be able to kind of identify. What else have we got? Oh, April says I like the silhouettes too. Another silhouette one, woman sitting in a car. I'll just sort of pull that one down here. So when setting up for this, there's in the first few months I played around a lot with whereabouts my little face would appear on this screen. Do I go top left corner, bottom right corner, and all the rest? Ultimately, I ended up setting myself in the top right corner of the screen, but no matter where I go, there will be some photos that I will end up interfering with. However, with this one, there's a little bit of lightness in here where if you zoom, we have actually got some of the face being seen. But mostly when you look at this one, it's kind of in shadow. And it's more about the car, the light on the other side of the car. Similarly then, if we go to this one. Now in this one, we've got... So we've got a musician up on stage, we've got a smoke, we've got silhouette kind of thing. We've also got his hair dangling down across the face, so we can't really see the face. Now, fine, if you then saw him walking down the street, you might recognise him by his hair, but you're not necessarily going to be able to recognise him by his face. So silhouette comes into it. Then onto a borderline one here, we have the idea of this is sort of semi-silhouette, but also shadows. So the way the lights are creating shadows so shadows are falling across the face. And each of the band members is to a different degree. So if we look at the trumpet player here, we can make out much more of his face. Less obvious with the face here, especially because this guy's wearing glasses and a hat. He's kind of obscuring part of his face to begin with, and then a lot of it's dropped into shadow. I think if he wasn't wearing his glasses and hat, I think you'd have problems recognising him in the street if this was the only photo you had to go on. The lead singer, most of his face is lost in shadow. We've got a bit of cheek, a bit of nose. He's also wearing sunglasses and a hat. So we're kind of into faceless portrait territory here. Now we're moving into the level whereby one or two people, or a certain percentage on a crowd voting situation will go, nah, I can see too much of his face. But I think for me, I'd probably be happy with that. Come down to, got a woman here. I think there's much more of her face we can see. And this guy, well, this is where I would say you're really borderlining on the edge, if you want to call it faceless portrait. Most of his face is obscured in shadow, but actually we can see just enough of his eye, just enough of the shape of his nose, just enough of the shape of his jaw, to the point whereby I would say that this guy is almost at the point of recognizable. That if you had this picture of him and then he happened to be walking down the street, and certainly if he was wearing that hat, there's a good chance you might be able to pick him out. Okay, so I think if we're going on that point of would you be able to recognize this person, you know, with that photo if you saw them in the street, I think in a way that's kind of where you're getting to with the faceless portrait bit. I mean, a hairstyle, some people can have very distinctive hairstyles, but if you had 3 or 4 people with that same hairstyle, but you didn't know what the face was, then, you know, so you can kind of see what I mean by the difference with that, I hope. Okay, so silhouette then is another way of playing with this. So far we've talked about the idea of then the back of someone's head or the side coming where you can kind of from a different angle. I mean, I didn't actually have any examples, but shooting from above potentially is another one, or shooting from below to a point whereby the chin is so far up that you've maybe got that or something. Then, you know, so essentially the angle from which you take the photo, if the face is not included, then that's where we tend to think of as the primary idea of a faceless portrait. But then we've also got this idea of silhouette and shadow, whereby it's obscured in darkness. Okay, so it's not that the face isn't there, but we can't see it because it's too dark. So those tend to be the kind of 2 major starting points for something like a faceless portrait. So just to take a quick breather here and to say that if you happen to be enjoying these podcasts and find them interesting, useful, entertaining or anything like that, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can contribute and help out with these podcasts. Another one is find me a sponsor, and then I can say these podcasts are sponsored by insert for all your camera or needs or whatever, you know. Right. The other thing you can do, of course, is invite your friends along. And, of course, if you want to send me anything, if you want to send me some images or you find an interesting article or something you'd like me to discuss on these things, then, I mean, my website here is kimayres.co.uk. You can email me kim@kimayres.co.uk. This is how to find me. And of course up here is a whole bunch of other places. You know, you already know me on YouTube, but I have the Instagram account, the Facebook, my website and the blog as well. So plenty of places to find. Right, that little interval over. Let's move on to the... Right, another question here. Nick says, would somebody holding something in front of their face work? Well, okay, actually that kind of brings me on to the next topic. Well, no, it doesn't actually. I'll come on to that because there's something else I want to talk. Yeah, so that idea of obscuring the face. Okay, so if we are obscuring the face with some part of the body, then or some kind of prop, does that count? And yes, it does. And I'm going to explore that one in a minute, Nick. So bear with me. But there's one other bit that I want to get to before I get to direct obscuring, putting something in the front, which is the notion of a blur. Whether motion blur, movement blur, something like that, where actually, so the face becomes is blurred out in some form or another. Now, I don't just mean like pixelated, as in when you have like particularly news articles and somebody's supposed to not be identified, so they pixelate the face. Although you can get creative if you want to do that. But if we do something like, where are we? There. So this one here. Picture of a dancer in a dance studio, and this was done on, I think it was, you know, a third of a second or half a second exposure, and it was deliberately, I did a whole series of photos with this dancer where we did a timed exposure in order to create a sense of movement. And if you're trying to capture movement with the camera, you either need to be able to freeze a moment that couldn't be frozen otherwise. So if you've got somebody mid-jump, you capture that moment. Or another way of doing it is to do long exposure as such that during the time that the shutter was open, part of the body moved and sort of smeared, smudged, blurred across that space. And so in this case, we can't see the face because of movement. Now, also, actually, her arm happens to be obscuring it for part of that movement as well. Now, I used this same idea, one of the previous podcasts, in fact, yes, a couple of years back, I did a set of photos for Kukubri Art Gallery, where I did a day in the life of the gallery. And what I did with that was I did a whole series of photos. It was a really dull, overcast day. There wasn't a lot of light coming in. And so I decided to go with this idea of just taking photos of people and long exposure images. And this particular one was one of my favourites. So this was sort of inside. So there was the Viking Horde, the Galloway Horde, which was so a whole set of ancient Viking silver and treasure and everything else had been found not too far from where I live, and it was one of the biggest hoards to be found in the UK, so over 1,000 years old. And eventually, after being cleaned up and being away in Edinburgh for 10 years, it came back and it was on display in the Kukubri galleries. And while it was there, that display happened to be on when I was doing the day in the life of Kukubri galleries. And so here I set up, I think it was something like a 4 or 5 second exposure. And during this time, we're also just into the kind of post-COVID, still COVID, but everybody's sort of still wearing masks. But we are allowed to now move around and museums have become open again. There was a screen on where people were watching about some of the history of how the things were found or whatever. And during those 3 or 4 seconds that I took to take the photo, these two people didn't move. They're still fairly sharp. Now, they are kind of faceless because we're back to the point whereby both of them have masks over their faces. Although we do have eyes, but because they've got hats on and they're not looking at the camera, and we're into, I can kind of get away with that. Then we have here where this person had moved and shuffled about. So they've not only have they got the mask, but they're slightly blurry too. This person over here, in the course of the time, had gone from bent over looking at this amazing pot to standing up. And so at this point, we're definitely into faceless because there's no way you will be able to identify this person other than via their clothing, certainly not by their face. And in the background here, we had somebody who, during the course of it, we can see another footstep here, had moved out of the picture altogether. So that notion then of time, allowing you time to blur out. So if the face becomes unidentifiable that way. And I think this notion of a blurred picture can be really quite interesting in terms of the faceless portrait. Because you can still kind of have the face there, it's just that the face has become completely unrecognisable. So next, where are we going to go? Oh yeah, I think, and then there was another one just from this here where we can see the same. Here we've got backs of heads, but we've also got backs of heads and blurred movement as well. So that's, you're kind of getting to this notion of combining ideas. Oh, there's one other idea of blur as well, which is when you're focused on something in the foreground and the person happens to be in the background. So if we take something like this was part of a photo shoot I did for a textile designer, and we done a whole series of photos in a bit of woodland where the sun was coming through the trees, and our model Anna here had been wearing this textile kimono style jacket that my friend Morag had made, but we also decided to do a shot where the jacket was actually hanging on a tree. And then the model herself was in the distance with a shaft of light coming down the hills through the ferns, lighting her up. Now, if I had focused on her face would have been lit up, side profile, you would have been able to see enough of her face such that, yes, I would recognise her walking down the street. But because she is now out of focus, we are now into a kind of faceless portrait level. We can't see really who she is. So sometimes, but we still got information about her because we've got information about the jacket that she's wearing that's in focus in front of us. So that notion sometimes that if you're wanting to have some kind of significant thing in the foreground and the person themselves are out of focus in the background, if they are sufficiently out of focus, then I think you might be able to just about get away with it. So you could, for example, say have a guitarist whereby if you are down at one end of the neck of the guitar, you're down maybe where they tune the guitar, and then you're looking up the guitar, but the foreground where it's being tuned is in focus, but the guitarist himself is out of focus to the point whereby you wouldn't be able to recognize them. Then I think you could talk there about the idea of a sort of faceless portrait as well. So at this point then, the next thing then we're moving into is this notion of obscuring the face. So to go back to Nick's point, would it work with somebody holding something in front of their face? And actually there are a huge amount of photographs on the web of people doing precisely that. The number of selfies you see of people in bathrooms, especially young people, younger generation, grandchildren, all that kind of stuff. Constantly seeing pictures of them on Instagram in public bathrooms and restrooms and stuff like that, where they're taking photos. They've gone out for the evening and they're taking photos of themselves, and they want, granddaughter has got this photo of her in this fancy dress, and she's got the camera there. Now she's doing a full-length portrait because what she's wanting to show off is her dress and her body in the dress, and this is what she's looking like, except for the fact she's got the phone in front of the face. Okay? Oh, now, of course, they do them all that way. I tend to do it that way. So, I mean, that in itself, is that a faceless portrait? And yes, it is. At this point now, enough of my face has been obscured, but the fact that I'm holding this up. Now, if this was a reflection in what you're seeing rather than just through the camera, so that notion then that these are happening all the time, this notion of this, the camera itself getting in the way. And there are an awful lot of self-portraits by photographers who do exactly the same thing. You go to profile of 90%, not 90, quite 90%, but you go to places like PhotoCrowd or ViewBug or things like that, an awful lot of photographers, their profile picture, anyone that's trying to say, hey, I am a photographer, I'm a serious photographer, I'm a professional photographer, very often have a picture of themselves with their camera in front of the face. Now, I did a version of that myself, playing around with this, when I was actually at the Kakubri Galleries, doing that shoot that I was talking about with the time when the Viking Horde was there. I took this photo in the lift or the elevator, where of course there are big mirrors. And I thought, well, this would be quite interesting, take a photo of the photographer in the space. And here, most of my face is obscured. So, all we can see of my face is one eye. A third to half my face is obscured by the camera. Another third of my face is obscured by my mask. So actually, most of my face is obscured here. This becomes, in essence, a faceless portrait because, okay, it's me, but there's enough of my face covered that it's not necessarily guaranteed. You can't tell, for example, even that I have a beard in this one. With only one eye, whereas with two eyes, and then where the eyes were actually the main focus of the photo, I think you're kind of in more borderland. With this, I think it's much clearer, the fact that you can get away with the idea of a sort of faceless portrait. Most of the face has been obscured by what's in front of it, which in this case is the mask and the camera. So there's that version of it. Another version of the same kind of thing here, where you've got the camera and the arm of the person itself going across the face. So yeah, this definitely would fall into this notion of faceless portrait. So yeah, photographers, we're already familiar with this idea of camera in front of the face. But it can be something else as well. Hats are another one. Now, in this case, you can kind of see the eyes through the face, through the hat, a little bit, but it's mostly you can't. You've really got to push to notice it. All we're left with here is the bottom half of the face, the mouth. The nose, we're not really getting the nose. We are getting the nose ring, which is telling us something about this model. But this here, I think, again, if you were going for the faceless portrait and you entered this, you could probably get away with it. You were talking about the fact that enough of the face is obscured for it to feel like the faceless portrait. Oh, April says I like the one with the field. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting kind of environmental shot as well. Then there's the notion of this one I took of my son many years ago, back when he had a mohawk, and it was back again when I think probably taken around the same year as that woman who was stepping across the snow in her high heels. So sometime around about 10, 11, 12 years, maybe even longer actually now, possibly 13, 14 years ago. We, in the garden, we had enough snow to build a snowman, and we decided to build a snowhecan. And the snowhecan to go along with Rogan's own Mohican haircut. Now, here, I think there's this, again, you can call it, I think you can get away with this as a faceless portrait. Before the days of COVID, just the days when it was cold and he's got his scarf wrapped up around his face. What we're seeing here is the hair and eyebrows, but not enough of the face. And then the fact that it's echoed in the snowman, I think, is a bit of fun. So that notion then that, yes, you can have a mask over the face and other aspects of it as well. Sandra says, I like the model with the hat. Other ideas then, but you can take the mask, you can go full mask stuff. So in this case, like a welder, there's a complete mask on here, and this is definitely faceless portrait territory. Or getting even closer here, again, there's no chance of seeing the face whatsoever, but we are in no doubt there's a face behind the mask. We're not worried about that. Not unless you're kind of into your zombie films in a big way. Or maybe you would still have a face behind the mask. It just wouldn't be a very pleasant one to look at. We have no idea what this person looks like, but we are in no doubt that there is a face there. But there is an action shot, and it's a close in, and I'm playing around again with light and line to create something interesting because we can't see the face. Okay, other ideas, hands in front of the face as well. There's a whole other shoot I did with this where Zoe was getting splattered and covered in paint. I decided her hands were covered, and we did a couple of shots where she just sort of played around with hands in front of the face. And in this case, we've got one eye, a bit like my picture in the elevator. One eye really is all I could be, a bit of an eye over here, but the face is covered, really is that the hands are obscuring the face. So we have something obscuring enough of the face that, again, if you went for faceless portrait, I think you could get away with something like this. And then the other one, the big one for obscuring the face, is hair. Okay, so in something like this, if somebody is throwing their hair about, if the wind happens to have caught the hair, then the hair obscuring the face really gives you a way of having a faceless portrait as well. So especially somebody, obviously you need enough hair, you need long hair. Wouldn't work with my hair. This one, a variation on another popular photo of mine that tends to do quite well, is where I was doing another fashion shoot for Morag, the textile designer, at a different time. We had a single light, and what we were playing around with was not just the outfit that and the pose, but also the shadow. The key thing here was I was using a single spotlight at night in order to create interesting shadows along with the pose. And for that, our model Jessica here was throwing her hair up. And when she's throwing her hair up like this, as well as creating these lovely lines here, it just has obscured her face. We can't actually see what she's looking like with this. And here's one from another angle, which I took, where the whole of the face is not just, whereas with this one, there's a bit of the face still clear. In this one, there is no face whatsoever. We really can't make it, or maybe you can just about make out some lips and a little bit of jaw there. Is that a touch of nose, perhaps? But that becomes a really, now if you're talking faceless portrait, I think that one really kind of captures it a lot. We've got the whole body, we've got this wonderful shadow, but we cannot see the face at all. April says, like your favourite Maggie pic. And yep, you're right. So that idea of hair obscuring the face in the wind, You beat me to it. I thought I had to include it. In this case, this is a faceless portrait of Maggie. There's still enough of my face, so actually I couldn't really put this one in. Had Maggie's hair come across even further and more of my face had been obscured, then actually that could have been quite a fun photo of what you call a faceless portrait if both of us had been covered by Maggie's hair. I suppose the only other way that I could, well, there are other ways. You can now. I didn't get a chance. Ran out of time. I was going to try and take a photo of a reflection or a photo through glass which has been steamed up. So that notion of distorting through glass, whether it's through other reflections happening in the glass or through water droplets or things like that, is another way of playing around with it. Or if you really want to go kind of full Photoshop, you can remove the face entirely. So another definition of a faceless portrait there. I won't leave that one on the screen for you for too long. Right, okay, so hopefully then that's giving you a few ideas for the notion of the faceless portrait. So to kind of sum up then, the notion of a faceless portrait is that you cannot see the face, but it is still a portrait. It is still telling us something about the person that we have photographed. So in order to be able to communicate that kind of narrative, we have to get that little bit more inventive. We have to think about the background, we have to think about the clothes, we have to think about the angles, the lines, the sense of body language, maybe the props, anything which is going to communicate something about the person in the absence of the face being available to us to see. And how creative you get with that is really up to you. But I think the more you explore that idea, so fine, start with the backs of heads. Move on to things like shadows and silhouettes. Play around with the notion of motion blur. Play around with the idea of props or objects or things that are actually in front of the face. But think about it in a creative way. I am now setting the Faceless Portrait Challenge for 2 weeks' time. So that's why it's currently the 10th. So for the 24th of November, I will go through all the pictures that everybody sends in to me. So send me through your images. You've got 2 weeks to play around with this. It can be a faceless self-portrait challenge if you wish. Try and get the images to me definitely no later than Friday the 22nd of November, because I still need time to be able to put everything together in time for the podcast. Meg said about the fact that she has emailed me pictures. While I was having a rest this afternoon, Meg did actually have a go trying to take some photos through a steamed up mirror for me, but unfortunately I just didn't have time to process them to show them to you. But so that's in. But thank you, Meg, for sending those to me. April says this is creepy. I presume she's talking about the one where I've removed my face in Photoshop. So a faceless portrait, not actually a photo, taken from a photo, but I've done so much to it that obviously it's a photoshopped image, not a direct real photograph. So hopefully then that is giving you enough ideas to play around with. I do hope you'll have a take on this challenge and give me a version of a faceless portrait, whether it's of somebody else, it can be of yourself as well, doesn't really matter. If you're going to be pushing out to the boundaries of really how much face you think is being included, if you are going to, the more face you're going to include, I think the more inventive you're going to have to be to keep my interest there and to say, well, why am I prepared to ignore the fact that there's more face available because there's something else that's interesting about the way the part that is obscured. So get creative. It's a place to really have fun and play, and I really hope you will take on that challenge. Next week we have a feedback session, okay? So this is your chance to send me your images for feedback and critique. There are very, very few places on the in the world, on the internet, even locally to where you are, where you can get genuine feedback on your images. Now, these can be images just for your own personal satisfaction. They can be images that you are planning on putting into future competitions. Whatever it is, if you want, send me your image. I will tell me what your sticking point is. Tell me what aspects of the photo that you're maybe struggling with. And I will do my best to help give you direct feedback on your photos. It is one of the most powerful ways of improving your photography. You can shove your images up on Facebook and all your friends will tell you how lovely it is, and that's great because that's what friends are supposed to do. But most of your friends are not photographers. Most of your friends, even the ones that do know something about photography, aren't going to say to the photo you posted on Facebook, actually, you know what, you should have done it differently, because we tend to be, we don't want to offend, okay? Not that I'm out to offend, but you know by now that it's constructive criticism. Send me your image and I will help you to advance your photos to the next level. So get them to me this week. I have a limited number of spaces. One of those has already been taken up by Graham, who sent me something last week. So I have space for maybe up to about 3 other images. It will be done on a more or less a first come, first served basis. So the sooner you get your image into me, the better. So send me your photos. I will do my best to give you feedback on them, and that's for next week. And then in 2 weeks' time, we have the Faceless Portrait Challenge. Get me your images by the 22nd of November, and we will then go through the images, see what everybody sent, and see how everybody has approached it in a very different way, and hopefully we can inspire each other to have a go at doing something else. Right, okay, what else have we got? Oh, Robert says you could create a photo crowd community contest as well with this. That's not a bad idea. Maybe I could. I'm thinking about the way that it goes forward. I couldn't get it so that yes, if I was to do that, then the photo crowd one would turn up after the challenge that I do, which isn't a bad idea, because what you learn from this you could maybe put into the photo crowd contest. I think for fairness, really, I think if I was going to do a photo crowd contest, it would have to be one that was community judged, not me judged. Because if I know, if you, you lot have all put in your images and I recognise those images, that's going to create an unfair advantage to other people entering the contest. But I think that's a good idea. I will play around with that idea. Okay. What else have we got? Oh, Susan says, suggesting that Robert could do that. And April's wisely pointing out that Robert wants to be able to stick one of the pictures in himself. Okay, cool. Excellent. Right, well, thank you very much to VG for coming up with the idea in the first place. I think it's been an interesting topic. Thank you to everybody who's turned up, left comments, and I really look forward to seeing what you're going to come up with. But of course, don't forget to stick your any images in for critique next week, and don't forget also, if you stick your image in for critique and I use it and I give you feedback, you get a bonus 25 smug points, which is absolutely to your advantage. Right now we're into this last run up to the end of the year. Okay, look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care. Bye bye.